precaution, which I think is Spanish for Achtung, Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. And you know what? We're about to go veering off topic. And very often on the podcast, we have said, if it's not the Second World War, simply not interested. But we're making a major exception today. I'm going to say it's because it's to do with an aeroplane that it's the Hawker, the Hurricane. There's your connection. That should do it, shouldn't it, Jim?
Well, yeah, and also one of the characters involved, he'd been in the Second World War.
Yep.
It's closer to the Second World War than it is to today.
Yeah, okay.
It's the first time one squadron goes into action since the Second World War, I believe I'm right in saying. And actually, what's amazing reading Roland's book is just how familiar it all is.
Yeah. So we are joined today by Rowland White. So we'd gone off on one then.
It never happens.
Good morning. Good morning, Rowland. Thank you very much for joining us. You've written about the Falklands before, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, it was my first book. I mean, James was the very first person actually to even know I was thinking about it. We went on a walk near his house in Wiltshire, and I said, look, I got this idea that I want to try and write a story about the first Vulcan raid of the Falklands War, which was, the most remarkable British bombing raid since Second World War, and I wanted to try and bring people right into the cockpit of that bomber and of the tankers that supported it. And James, as he is, was very encouraging. So I think that's a great idea. Have a crack at it. And so I did. And that was 10, 15 years ago now. And so this is the first return with this Harrier book to the Falklands since then. But as you say, the Falklands was so much closer to the end of the Second World War than we are to the Falklands now. And there were, the three chiefs of the services, Henry Leach, Bramall, and Sir Michael Beetham, had all served in the Second World War. And indeed, there were people down in the Falklands, not least the captain of Atlantic Conveyor.
Well, it is the peculiar umbilical cord, in fact, to the past in that respect that I suppose it is now gone, isn't it? It's this, and Thatcher's, after all, Peter Carrington had served in Guards Armoured, and obviously resigned over the Falklands debacle. So how old were you when the Falklands War happened?
I was 11 years old, and I was at school, and I remember it being the first time that I'd ever really engaged with the newspapers every day. You get the Times, Telegraph, Mail every day, and you'd race to go and read them and find out what news there was of progress in the war. And I remember Ian MacDonald, the Ministry of Defence spokesman, coming on the TV every day with his sort of Coke bottle glasses and sort of fantastically mannered delivery, announcing that yesterday in the Falklands the Sea Harrier fighter bomber aircraft had shot down 3 Dagger Mirage fighter bomber aircraft, and I think there were efforts to sort of remove him because it was so peculiar, and there was such a public outcry because we'd all got used to him and sort of grown to love him, that anyone sort of considered sort of more professional and polished, we just weren't having it.
So I was 14 and suddenly, and with an interest in military history, suddenly you had this thing on.
Yeah.
You had it happening on the television.
Exactly.
And you kind of got a blow by blow thing. Obviously we didn't know everything that was going on, but you kind of got a blow by blow thing. You had drawings by David Ace, was the graphic artist in the Daily Mail. You'd have a David Ace drawing, of a Harrier strafing Goose Green, and it was when I was 14, it was utter catnip.
I know, but it was magic. Yeah.
But the thing that's central, in fact, to the British ability to pull off the Falklands campaign is the Harrier, isn't it? There's no two ways about it. Without that aircraft, the British government would have had to throw in the towel, go to the UN. And
I think what's amazing about your book, though, Rowland, is the fact that it took you so long to write it. Because when you're looking at the Harrier, I mean, frankly, what's not to like? I mean, it's an absolutely incredible aircraft. And I'm amazed it took you so long to write about the air war of the Falklands.
Yeah, I mean, no, since the book's been published, I've been wondering the same thing. I mean, why on earth did it take me sort of 15 years to get to this after writing it, Vulcan 6 or 7? And actually, the reason, there is a reason for that. I spoke to Tim Gedge, who's the boss of 809 Squadron.
He's one of the heroes of the book, really, isn't he?
Yeah, he's very much the sort of central character there, and he's a lovely chap who had previously flown Phantoms off HMS Ark Royal,
and
which
Sea
is anyone who
Vixens.
and Sea Vixens. I mean, anyone who grew up in the 70s will remember Rod Stewart whaling away to the Sailor documentary and the Phantoms and Buccaneers flying off Ark Royal. And that too captured my imagination, and here was a sort of more recent iteration of it. So I'd said to Tim after writing about Ark Royal, actually, that I really wanted to talk to him about 809's war during the Falklands, and felt that it because there had been books about the Falklands Air War, that I hadn't really got away in it. It didn't feel like quite a sort of big enough subject for me to bring anything fresh to. And it wasn't until 2013 when it was announced that the first of the new, the first Fleet Air Arm F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which I don't suppose is an airplane you hear much about on We Have Ways, the new stealth jet entering service with the Royal Air Force Fleet Air Arm, was going to be 809 Squadron. I thought, right, that's the way into this. We can bring the whole thing up to date by saying, and this is what 809 Squadron are up to today. And so that was when I dropped Tim a line and said, look, I know how to do this. I know what I want to do. I really want to tell 809 Squadron story. And I realised as soon as I got in that this sort of short, sharp account of 809's war that I thought I was going to write was not going to be.
Yeah, you got a little bit carried away on that one, didn't you?
Yeah, I really did. It ended up being twice as big as I thought.
We got 51 Squadron, photo reconnaissance doing spy missions with Nimrods and Canberras and stuff. You've got number 1 Squadron with Peter Squire, you've got Sharky Ward,
that's right,
and all the rest of it. But I think what's so interesting about the Falklands War is the executioner's acts, the kind of the dreaded governmental white paper is hovering over the Royal Navy and the Air Force and just at every part of the kind of Britain's defences. And what's so fascinating is that Tim Gedge is suddenly got a staff job, and he's thinking that the latest carrier, HMS Invincible, is about to be sold to Australia. That the Navy and the Naval Air Squadrons are going to be absolutely savaged. And the next thing he knows is saying, actually we haven't got enough. Can you form another squadron?
Yeah. I mean, the Navy was sort of feeling fantastically bruised at the time. I mean, John Knott was the Defence Secretary and had pushed through these very savage cuts to the Navy, and they we were, as we always are, sort of spending too much, and he had to make a decision. This is about what the Navy was for, what the armed forces more generally were for. And at the time, the focus was on NATO and on the possibility of a war with the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact. And the Royal Navy's job in that kind of encounter was going to be protecting the shipping lanes from Soviet submarines. And so the whole of the Royal Navy was really focused on that job in support of the US Navy's aircraft carriers, big supercarriers, on anti-submarine warfare. And it's only sort of by the skin of its teeth that the Navy, through the existence of the Hawker Harrier, Sidney Cam, the Hurricane designer's last aeroplane for Hawker, was able to put some fixed-wing aircraft on these small Invincible class carriers to act as a defence or a deterrent to sort of Soviet maritime patrol aircraft, and nothing more than that really. It was only by the skin of its teeth that they had these this small number of fixed-wing aeroplanes that might make possible, as Al was saying earlier, any adventure in the South Atlantic. Without those Harriers, and Henry Leach was absolutely clear, the chief of the naval staff, without the Sea Harrier there could have been no task force, and obviously without the task force the Falklands would still be in Argentinian hands. I mean, there was just simply no doubt about it. We couldn't have sent a task force without the air cover.
Because the Harriers are the only jet that can operate that far from Britain on those carriers.
Yeah. Well, and the Navy have wound down their strike capability anyway, because Buccaneer, is a low-level nuclear strike aircraft during the 70s, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that all comes to the end because part of it is the politics inside the Navy is that Trident is the reason to keep the Navy going actually, even now. If the money's running out, what you do is you put the money in the subs and you get rid of the duplication in the form of Buccaneer. So it is the most extraordinary thing, though, that weapon designed for something else ends up filling a gap that no one ever imagined it was required.
Well, it filled all the roles. I mean, the captain of Hermes at the time, Lynn Middleton, said that he described the Sea Harrier as a Swiss Army knife of jets, and it had to do everything because there was nothing else that could take off from those little carriers. There was nothing. I mean, the expression we haven't used yet is jump jet. The Harrier Jump Jet was the only successful vertical takeoff and landing aeroplane in the world. And it had been up until this point kind of rather loudly criticised and dismissed often as an aeroplane that couldn't carry a box of matches from one side of a football pitch to the other. And it wasn't really taken seriously as a warplane by lots of people. The senior people at the Pentagon said the British had simply no chance of pulling off a victory in the South Atlantic. It was too far away. We didn't have super carriers like Ark Royal was not a super carrier, but it had some level of equivalence to those big American carriers in Phantoms and Buccaneers and airborne early warning in the form of Gannets, and we just didn't have any of that. We had just 20 when the task force sailed south. We had just 20 Sea Harriers, no airborne early warning, and just 2 very small aircraft carriers from which they could fly.
I mean, my chest is on the one hand swelling with pride, on the other hand, kind of sort of sinking with despair. I kind of feel really conflicted.
Well,
by this.
the folly of the bloody thing when you put it like that. And obviously there is that moment where Thatcher has to decide what she's going to do. And there's the famous conversation, isn't there? We've got to do this or we won't matter as a country anymore. And I'm ambivalent about that idea anyway. Because after all, there's a school of thought that says the Falklands is the thing that then leads, the success of the Falklands campaign is the thing that leads to British military overconfidence. We can punch above our weight and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
All the way to Iraq.
All the way to Iraq, but the jet. So the Harrier was notoriously unsafe as well. It was a tricky aeroplane to learn to fly and all that stuff.
Well, there's another joke which sort of does the circles in the sort of Harrier world, which is how do you know if somebody's a Harrier pilot? Because they'll tell you. I did that. They definitely regarded themselves as a cut above, and it was a difficult aeroplane to fly. I mean. It was probably at about the limit of what reasonably you could expect a sort of squadron, service pilot to fly. But the amazing thing down in the Falklands, particularly with respect to 809, which was this squadron pulled together after the invasion. So we only had 2 frontline squadrons at the time of the invasion, each of which was nominally only 5 aeroplanes strong. So this is real sort of skin of the teeth stuff. So Tim Gedge, 5 days after the invasion, actually on the day that the fleet sailed, was asked to form a new squadron, and he had only 2 months earlier relinquished command of 800 Naval Air Squadron. And so he drove to Yeovilton, was told he had to get his aeroplanes and his pilots ready to go south in 3 weeks' time, which meant that he was pulling jets off the British Aerospace production line, getting them out of attrition reserves at St Athan, pulling them out of test squadrons at Boscombe Down and at Dunsfold, where British Aerospace developed the jet, and then scrambling to find pilots from around the world. He found a pilot on exchange in California and Arizona. There was one in Australia who was learning to fly as an air warfare instructor with the Australian
And it's amazing because they're flying back across the Atlantic, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they're flying back across the Atlantic and literally landing and then going straight to Yeovilton.
Yeah, but the best of them are the 2 RAF pilots who are kind of in the bar on Friday night, and the squadron, the station commander comes and asks them what they're doing on Monday. So, we're going down to, Gütersloh or whatever to do some air combat training with the Phantoms. And he says, no, you're not. You're off to Yeovilton. We've got some good news and bad news. You're going to war, but you're going to war with the Navy. And so these guys who'd never flown off an aircraft carrier, they'd never flown a Sea Harrier, but had some experience flying Lightnings before they joined 3 Squadron flying Harriers in Germany, found themselves flying backwards in a back piston engine Pembroke to Yeovilton to join 809 Naval Air Squadron, where they had, I mean, less than 10 hours training in a Sea Harrier before going south aboard Atlantic Conveyor. And I mean, that, as you well know, I mean, you know, even Battle of Britain Spitfire and Hurricane pilots were given more than 10 hours on the OCU before they joined the frontline squadrons.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. But they kind of sort of pull it off, though, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, they do. I mean, John Leeming, who was one of those RAF pilots, was tipped into battle in defence of in the effort to defend HMS Ardent from attack, and found himself sitting on the tail of an Argentine Skyhawk, just pressing every button he could to try and get the sidewinders to fire. I mean, you know, got this sort of the famous Sidewinder growl in his headphones, and he just couldn't get the bloody things to go. And eventually, as he was getting closer and closer, this thing was filling up his gun sight. He switched to guns and just started sort of drilling it with 30mm Aiden rounds. Yeah, and the thing broke up and exploded in front of him, and he just flew through the fireball until that's, you know, sort of ducked below the coaming, and tried to make himself feel small, feeling sure that flying through this cloud of debris was going to bring him down too. And the reason he couldn't find the Sidewinders because he'd just forgotten how to do it after, you know, half an hour's training, and so, you know, it's sort of the first fast jet guns kill of the Falklands War.
We're talking to Rowland White about Harrier 809. Welcome back. We're talking to Rowland White about the Falklands War and his new book, Harrier 809. What training did they do on the journey south then, if any? Was it all theoretical, or did they get
all theoretical. It was kind of lectures. I mean, they had a sort of program of training, very little of which was in the air. I mean, you know, one of the they were flying by helicopter, the one squadron Harrier pilots over to Atlantic Conveyor when the weather permitted it. They were getting ground training there. On which the RAF and the Navy sometimes had very different views. And they kept one of the Sea Harriers on the pad on Atlantic Conveyor, ready to scramble to intercept potentially Argentine 707 that were trying to shadow the task group's progress south. And that would have been the first time that they'd launched a fighter from a merchant ship since the days of the Hurricanes and the merchant
and that's
aircraft.
Winkle Brown, isn't it?
Yeah, firing these Hurricanes off. There's a lovely story about the Condors. Yeah, there's the very first time that happened. It was a pilot called Bob Everett, who was fired in a clapped out old fighter from a merchant ship when the convoy was being threatened by a Condor, and he shot it down. And he said it was the most exciting thing he'd ever done. And obviously he had to bail out and then get rescued from sea. And that's saying something, because this was a man who'd previously won the Grand National. And I love those stories that you sort of stumble on when you're doing the research for these books. These extraordinary characters that you come across. So yeah, Bob Everett nearly found kind of a successor in Tim Gedge or Dave Braithwaite, who was a senior pilot on 809. I mean, they were actually scrambled, and then that decision to launch them was pulled off. But you know, it would have been a hell of a thing. And they had mixed feelings about it being pulled off. I mean, on the one hand, they both wanted to be the first person to take a jump jet off a merchant ship and shoot down an enemy aircraft. On the other hand, they both knew that they're very, very unlikely to get back on board.
I mean, Roland, one of the things that just surprised me was just how much what an important. I hadn't kind of really appreciated just the role of the air battle, and just how much fighting there was and air combat there was. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting was how you also included the experience of the Argentinians, and there was there's that one air combat where Al Craig and Sharkey Ward are chasing that Pucara. Is that how you pronounce it, a Pucara?
Yeah, that's right, Pucara.
With Juan Tomba in, and he's getting absolutely shot to bits.
Hammered,
absolutely hammered. And, you know, and Sharkey Ward sees the plane start, you know, the wings start to go, and then the kind of cockpit starts to go, and flames start to appear, and then suddenly the Martin Baker ejector seat comes in, and this guy survives. I mean, it's just incredible.
Oh no, I was very, very lucky. I mean, I said I'd planned to do this sort of short, sharp account of 809's war, and wasn't until I started getting into the research I suddenly realised that, of course, nobody's written about the air war since the records were declassified, which meant I had a sort of stack of files after going to the National Archives that were essentially kind of virgin with respect to writing about the air war. So that was a source of amazing material. But also, Al, you've kind of illustrated this earlier in the podcast. I mean, Google Translate was my friend. All of those Argentine veterans have been interviewed extensively by Argentine newspapers and magazines. And a lot of those interviews are online. I don't speak Spanish, but I could use Google Translate to get the gist of what they were saying, and also sort of bring a little bit of, my own understanding of what I'm writing about to make it an accurate translation rather than a literal translation of what was intended, getting the sort of technical aspects of it. So I was able to weave in the Argentine pilots' experience in a way that, again, I don't think had really been done before. And they were brave, skilled, and fantastically committed, and believed that the cause was noble as well. And I hope I've really done justice to their side of the story as well. Certainly there was no lack of respect between the British and the Argentine pilots, either then or indeed subsequently. I think that they felt that they were both worthy opponents.
So they were flying. The Argentinians were flying all sorts of different sorties, weren't they? Because you intimated that they're trying to ghost the convoy. Mm-hmm. They're sending famously the Exocet Mirages out. But what else? And then trying to interdict at San Carlos Water. They're sending Skyhawks in particular to try and attack British shipping. But what else are they doing? Because like you say, they're very, very busy.
Yeah, well, there was no lack of kind of ingenuity on the Argentine side either. They had chaff dispensers built by a company that made pasta. I think they chopped up the aluminium foil for the chaff, which, as I'm sure people know, is a way of kind of breaking a radar lock using pasta makers. They fitted bombs beneath the wings of their C-130 Hercules transport planes, and in fact sank. That's not necessarily the finest hour, but they hit and sank a oil carrier near the end of the war, which is the sort of largest single tonnage, I think, at that point ever sunk by air. And they were flying sort of. They had a sort of paramilitary organisation called the Phoenix Squadron, which was used.
This was Learjets and stuff.
Yeah, Learjets, Hawker HS-125 business jets, used to sort of misdirect, but also as communications relay points as well. But they had two former Lancaster pilots flying those, RAF veterans who'd flown. One of them had bombed Berchtesgaden at the end of the Second World War as a Lancaster pilot, and an Anglo-Argentinian who absolutely was committed to the cause that Malvinas were Argentinian, and he was flying Learjets in support of Skyhawk and Mirage missions during the war. Two of them, actually. Yeah. Wow. Tito. Yeah.
So the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord reaches to Argentina on both sides.
Yeah.
Argentina, that's incredible.
Yeah, and then we haven't even talked about Chile yet. They were in the thick of it all as well.
Well, that's amazing. That was a sort of a whole diplomatic mission, wasn't it, to enable those spy missions to take place?
Yeah, that was fun. That was one of the discoveries as I sort of got into the archives, was these sort of fleeting references to things which were in substance redacted. Operation Folklore, Operation Acme, RAF operations mounted from Chile that were clearly providing intelligence to the task force, an early warning of air attacks. I mentioned we didn't have airborne early warning. We didn't have a sort of the equivalent of sort of AWACS providing us with warning and information about those low-level air attacks. And so we were dependent on intelligence from the mainland and to an extent from submarines that were sitting off the coast of Argentina. And this was provided a number of different ways. One was dispatch of an RAF mobile radar to Chile. And that was flown over just before the fighting started with a 10-man RAF radar operating crew. There was an RAF attaché dispatched to negotiate with the Chilean Air Force. who was in Santiago throughout the war. And there was a sort of a team of signallers, not actually SAS signallers, Signals Regiment, SAS support signallers in the head of the Air Force Intelligence HQ, relaying information from those radars and from SAS observation posts down there in Chile. And there was this 51 Squadron Nimrod operating off a sort of remote South Pacific island base, flying secret missions with Chilean Air Force, Chilean Navy personnel on board. And one occasion it was intercepted by the Chilean Air Force and sort of dived to low level over the Beagle Channel to try and get away, not knowing kind of quite what was going on. Another occasion it lost an engine and came screaming into this island, which was literally a runway which went from cliff to cliff. One engine down with no reverse thrust, and blew up the main wheel assembly and burst the brakes and stuff. So they then had to fly. They were kind of off games for 4 days after that. They had to fly in a new engine, new main wheel assembly to get the jet airborne again. And after that interception and the sort of second near miss, they decided that possibly discretion was better part of valor, and that was sent. So I mean, that would have been a huge diplomatic incident. Seeing a Nimrod shot down or lost in the South Pacific with senior Chilean personnel on board. No hiding that one. Yeah.
But the other thing is that it strikes me that so many of the decisions that the ship's captains and commanders have to make are really echo the decisions of the Second World War as well. And there's a time where Sandy Woodward is kind of sort of thinking about Admiral Cunningham in the Mediterranean and the evacuation of Crete. And there is a sort of irony because, of course, the British land on the Falklands on the same day that the Germans invade Crete in 1941, but in 1982, 41 years later. But I mean, it seems to me that the big conundrum for Sandy Woodward, who's the admiral in charge of the task force, is how far do you push in your aircraft carriers? Because the closer you get to the Falklands, the greater they're at risk from the Argentinian Air Force, who, after all, massively outnumber in terms of aircraft what the British can bring to bear. But on the other hand, if you're not aggressive, you're not going to be able to do what you need to do. So you've got this kind of calculated risk, isn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely the tension for Woodward throughout. And you read his memoir, which is exceptional, 100 Days, and you realise the extent to which he's sort of bearing responsibility for that. Alone, essentially, because there are competing arguments on both sides. There are some more aggressive captains pushing for a decision to move closer to the Falklands. There are others who are saying, Woodward himself particularly knows that should he lose one of those carriers, particularly Hermes, which was the bigger of the two, he'd have to pack up and go home. There was, and there's another echo of the Second World War here as well, in that with the absence of airborne early warning, they were having to use the escorts, the frigates and the destroyers as picket ships, and that was, of course, exactly what was happening during the Pacific War. You're having to put radar pickets a long way, isolated radar pickets a long way ahead of the main task force that could provide some kind of early warning of an incoming air attack. And so that was why Sheffield was lost. It was why Coventry was lost, in that they were so far ahead of the fleet, providing both air defence but also airborne early warning. And partly because there was experience of Second World War still at senior levels in the Navy. People like John Fieldhouse and Henry Leach had fought in Second World War. Not an appetite for, but an acceptance of the possibility that you would lose ships. We as you talked about Crete, I mean, that was after Crete that ABC, didn't he say something like, it takes 300 years to build a tradition, but 3 months to build a ship, or words to that effect. And that was very much in the minds of people like Fieldhouse and Leach, at a time when John Knott, the Defence Secretary, was really freaking out about how the loss of these destroyers and frigates was playing out in the press back home. It made it look like we were losing. Those escorts are expendable, essentially. You have as many as you need, expecting to lose some in pursuit of the greater gain, in pursuit of victory.
And the policy works because ultimately they do. The Argentinian air forces repeatedly try and sort of attack the aircraft carriers, and they always get repulsed, don't they? You know, Skyhawks being shot down and all the rest of it. And actually, isn't it Exeter? And Exeter's one of the ones that kind of shoots down one of the Skyhawks.
Yeah. I mean, there were 5 separate. They had 5 Exocet missiles, and I mean, another part of the book which was fascinating was the sort of the MI6 efforts that there were around the world to prevent them getting hold of more Exocet missiles. They had 5 air-launched Exocet missiles, I should add, launched from Super Étendards, these sort of French strike jets. And Sheffield was lost in the first attack. There was the second attack saw the end of Atlantic Conveyor, and that's a fascinating story in and of itself. And then the 5th attack, even though it was launched successfully, was essentially foiled through a combination of different things. There was sort of passive countermeasures, that's the chaff and the disposition of your ships. And there were active countermeasures, which is firing missiles and guns, and one of those shot down one of the attacking Skyhawks. But the result was, and the Navy was very clear about this in its report on that attack of the 30th of May, which was the last air-launched Exocet attack, we succeeded in defeating this attack. This didn't hit one of the ships. We foiled it. And while it was through a combination, I mean, even the disposition of the ships is critical, but not terribly sexy. While it was a combination of different elements that protected the carriers, and on that case, that combination of elements was successful in protecting the carriers. So job done.
That's all we have time for today in our interview with Rowland White. But there's part 2 coming out very soon, where we'll carry on talking about the Falklands. Cheerio!